Imagine a world where your future, your very standing in society, was decided not by your hard work or cleverness, but purely by whether you were born a boy or a girl. Would you believe that in 690 women faced a wall of unseen rules and ancient customs that often blocked them from inheriting family wealth and land? Get ready to uncover the surprising truth about how these hidden rules shaped lives centuries ago. Number 9. The Salic Law Wall. Picture this. You are a young woman, perhaps named Lyra, living in a small Frankish village in the year 690. Your father, a sturdy and respected farmer, has no sons, only you and your younger sisters. You've always assumed that when he passed his land, the very soil that has fed your family for generations would pass to you. You've worked it, you know its seasons. You've watched your father's calloused hands teach you every secret of the earth. But then, a whisper, a custom, a law, as old as some of the trees in the forest itself, comes into play. It is called Salic Law, and it acts like an invisible, impenetrable wall. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was often a written rule, a stark declaration found in ancient legal texts, like the Pactus Legis Salicae, a collection of laws from the Frankish kingdom. This particular article, often cited by historians, specifically excluded women from inheriting Salic land. What was Salic land? It was in many interpretations the core family patrimony, the ancestral estates that were meant to stay within the male line. It was the very heart of the family's economic and social power. If your father's land was deemed Salic land, then Lyra, no matter how much you loved that land or how capable you were, it simply could not be yours by right of inheritance. Think of it like this. Your family's most valuable possession, the thing that gave them status and security, was earmarked for men only. It was a fundamental principle in many Germanic successor states to the Roman Empire. The reasoning scholars suggest was deeply rooted in the militaristic nature of these societies. Land ownership often came with obligations, military service, fealty to a lord, or the duty to provide soldiers. Women, generally not expected to serve in combat or lead armies, were therefore seen as unsuitable inheritors of this kind of property. This wasn't about a woman's intelligence or capability, but about her perceived role in a society heavily dependent on male warriors. So what happened to Lyra's family land? The law wasn't entirely heartless. It just rerouted the inheritance. Instead of going to Lyra, the land would pass to her father's closest male relative. Perhaps a brother, a cousin, or even a more distant kinsman. This created a strange dynamic. A woman could see her family's legacy, the very foundation of her upbringing, transferred to a relative she barely knew, simply because of a legal principle. It meant that a woman's future was often not tied to her birth family's wealth, but rather to the prospects of the man she might marry, or the goodwill of her male relatives. This was not a uniform law across all of Europe in 690 AD, but it was a dominant influence in the powerful Frankish territories which were expanding and shaping much of Western Europe. Its impact was profound because it codified in a legal text a powerful social norm that valued the continuation of the male line above all else when it came to the most important assets. It meant that a family without sons, no matter how prosperous, faced a legal cliff edge when it came to passing down its most valuable possessions directly to its daughters. The Salic Law stood as a formidable wall, redirecting streams of wealth and power away from women, even in the heart of their own families. Number 8. The eldest son takes all, or almost all. Even if the ironclad rules of Salic law didn't apply in every corner of Europe in 690, but another powerful custom often did: the deep-seated preference for the eldest son, known as male primogeniture. While it wasn't always written down in every legal code at this exact early medieval date, its influence was as strong as the roots of an ancient oak tree deeply embedded in the soil of tradition and social structure. Imagine a family, the Eriksons, with several children, There's Olaf, the eldest son, strong and earnest. Then there's Brynhild, the eldest daughter, intelligent and just as capable as Olaf. Below them are several younger sons and daughters. In a perfect world, one might think the parents would divide their inheritance equally, or according to need, or even based on who was best suited to manage the estate. But 690 was far from a perfect world for women, and the Erikssons' world was no exception. Prevailing custom, especially for significant property like land or a noble title, if they existed in this nascent form, was that the eldest son Olaf would inherit the vast majority, if not all, of the family's main assets. This wasn't always a strict, codified law, but it was a powerful social expectation, reinforced by the need for stable land ownership and the continuation of the family name and military obligations. The idea was to keep the estate intact, to prevent it from being fragmented into smaller and smaller parcels with each generation, which could weaken a family's economic and political power. One strong heir was preferred over several weaker ones. What did this mean for Brynhild? It meant that while Olaf stood to inherit the family manor, the fertile fields, and perhaps even the family's position in the local community, Brynhild's share would be significantly smaller if she received any direct inheritance of land at all. Her portion might be a sum of money, a collection of movables like jewelry or household goods, or most commonly a dowry, a payment or property given to her husband upon her marriage. This was her inheritance of sorts, but it was not about her gaining control over her family's ancestral lands. It was about enabling her marriage and supporting her future husband's household. Consider the social impact. If Olaf, the eldest son, were to tragically die, the inheritance would typically pass to the next eldest son, not to Brynhild. If there were no other sons, then the rules might become more complicated, possibly opening the door to female inheritance in specific circumstances, but usually under strict guardianship. It was almost as if women were seen as temporary custodians of property, if they ever held it, rather than true inheritors in their own right. This system of male preference, primogeniture, created a clear hierarchy within families. Sons, especially the eldest, were seen as the inheritors and continuers of the lineage and its assets. Daughters, while valued, were primarily seen as future wives and mothers, whose economic security would come from their husbands' families rather than their own. This wasn't necessarily a cruel system by the standards of the time. It was seen as practical, ensuring the strength and continuity of the family unit and its ability to meet its obligations to higher lords or the king. For women like Brynhild, it undeniably channeled the vast majority of family wealth and power away from them, effectively making their inheritance a second-class or even non-existent prospect when it came to the core family estate. The eldest son, almost by default, was the chosen vessel for the family's material future. Number 7. Dowry and dower as substitutes. Imagine you are Alara, a young woman in 690 odd, growing up in a prosperous household. You know that unlike your brother, you won't inherit the family farm or the workshop. Instead, your family is diligently saving and preparing something else for you: your dowry. This wasn't a casual gift. It was a crucial formal arrangement that profoundly shaped a woman's economic life and, crucially, often acted as a substitute for direct inheritance of her birth family's main assets. A dowry, or dos in Latin, was essentially property, money, or goods that a woman brought with her into marriage. It was intended to establish her in her new household, to provide for her needs, and sometimes to even contribute to the new couple's joint estate. Think of it as your parents' investment in your marriage, making you a more attractive bride and ensuring your economic standing within your husband's family. For many women, this dowry was the only significant portion of their family's wealth they would ever directly receive or be associated with. It wasn't about giving her control over ancestral lands. It was about facilitating her transition into another family's lineage. Consider the implications. Your parents weren't giving you an equal share of their land, they were giving you a dowry that in essence paid your way into another family. This meant that the wealth you brought into your marriage often became managed, if not outright owned, by your husband. While the dowry was technically for your benefit, ensuring you had a secure position, you rarely had independent control over it once married. It was another way the family fortune, particularly the valuable land, stayed within the male line. The dowry channeled a daughter's share of wealth outwards, cementing her connection to her new husband's family rather than solidifying her independent claim to her birth family's legacy. Then there was the concept of dower, or donatio propter nuptiis. This was slightly different. Dower was property or assets set aside by the husband for his wife upon marriage, intended to provide for her if she became a widow. It was like an early form of widow's provision. So, if Alara's husband passed away, the dower would ensure she had a means of support, a roof over her head, and resources to live on, preventing her from becoming destitute. This provision was critical in a society where women had limited independent economic means. While both dowry and dower provided women with some economic security, it's important to understand their function in the context of inheritance. They were not about passing on the family's core productive assets, the land, the main workshop, the family name, to daughters. Instead, they were mechanisms to transfer wealth related to the daughter in a way that supported the marriage institution and her role within it, while keeping the primary inheritance within the male line of her birth family. The dowry was her family's contribution to her new life, and the dower was her husband's provision for her future. Neither provided a pathway for a woman to independently inherit and control a significant portion of her ancestral family's primary estate. For women in 690, a dowry and dower were not minor aspects of life. They were central. They defined a woman's economic value in the marriage market and provided crucial, albeit often managed, security. But they also served as a clear signal that the main inheritance, the very fabric of family wealth and power, was intended for sons. These systems, while seemingly beneficial, were part of a larger framework that consistently redirected female inheritance away from the family's primary legacy, pushing women into a financial dependence that was tied first to their fathers and then to their husbands. Number 6. Guardianship and lack of control. Imagine you are a woman named Isolde in 690. Add, by some rare twist of fate, perhaps because there were absolutely no eligible male relatives, you find yourself the inheritor of a piece of land from your deceased father, a fleeting moment of triumph, not so fast. Even when a woman did inherit property, the concept of full independent control, as understood today, was largely absent. This was the era of mundium, a Latin term referring to the legal guardianship or protection a woman was typically under, usually by her father, then her husband, or another male relative. Think of it like this. The land might be legally yours on paper, but you couldn't make independent decisions about it. You couldn't sell it, lease it, or even make major improvements without the consent, and often the direct involvement of your male guardian. This wasn't always because women were seen as intellectually inferior. Rather, it was rooted in the social and legal structures of the time, which placed women within a protective framework managed by men. It was believed that women needed this male guidance and protection in legal and financial matters. So Isolde might technically own the land, but her brother, her uncle, or even a distant male cousin might be appointed as her guardian. This guardian would manage the property, oversee its produce, negotiate its deals, and represent her in any legal disputes concerning it. While he was theoretically acting in her best interests, the practical reality meant that Isolde had very limited, if any, direct authority over her own inherited property. It was like owning a valuable chest, but only your guardian held the key and decided what was done with its contents. This system effectively created a situation where inheritance for women was conditional and mediated. It wasn't a transfer of full property rights and independent decision-making. Instead, it was a transfer of ownership that came with a heavy tether of male oversight. This wasn't just about land. It extended to other forms of wealth too. If Isolde inherited a sum of money or valuable goods, her guardian would likely oversee their management and disposition. Scholars often point to this practice as a strong indicator that societies in 690, and particularly in Germanic traditions, viewed women as having a diminished legal capacity, at least in financial and public matters. Their legal standing was often tied to their male protectors. This meant that while a woman might possess an inheritance, she rarely possessed the power that came with it. True power remained in the hands of the male guardian, who could use the property's proceeds for her benefit, but also potentially for his own, or to fulfill broader family obligations without her direct say. This lack of independent control was a significant barrier, even when direct inheritance wasn't completely prohibited. It meant that women were often relegated to a passive role in the management of wealth, even wealth that was legally theirs. The legal system, through the requirement of guardianship, ensured that the active power over property, and thus much of the economic and social influence derived from it, remained firmly in male hands, effectively restricting the true impact of any female inheritance. Isolde might own the land, but the power to use it, to shape its future, was not her own. Number 5. Marriage as property absorption. Imagine you are a young woman named Gisela in 690, living in a world where marriage is not just a union of hearts, but a deeply significant economic and social transaction. When Gisela marries, something fundamental often shifts regarding her personal property. This shift, often unspoken but legally profound, meant that much of what she owned, or might have inherited, could be absorbed into her husband's control, effectively restricting her independent wealth and the ability to pass it down through her own lineage. This phenomenon was rooted in the concept of coverture, a legal doctrine where, upon marriage, the legal identity of the wife became subsumed into that of her husband. In simple terms, they became one legal person, and that person was the husband. While the full, rigid form of coverture developed more distinctly in later centuries, its fundamental principles were already at play in 690, and especially in Germanic legal customs. So what did this mean for Gisela's inheritance? If she inherited some land, perhaps a small portion not subject to Salic Law or male primogeniture, or if she brought property into the marriage as part of her dowry, it would typically fall under her husband's management. He would control its revenues, make decisions about its use, and generally act as its legal representative. While some arrangements might exist where a woman retained a theoretical claim to certain property, like a dowry that would revert to her family if the marriage was annulled or she died without children, the practical reality was that her independent control often vanished upon her wedding day. Consider a scenario. Gisela inherits a flock of sheep and a small orchard from her mother. After she marries Einar, Einar now manages the sheep, sells their wool, harvests the fruit, and decides how the profits are used for the family. While Gisela might still feel a connection to her inherited goods, the economic power derived from them now rests firmly with Einar. This isn't just about management, it's about the erosion of her distinct legal identity concerning property. She cannot independently buy, sell, or mortgage these assets without her husband's agreement, and often it was his name that appeared on any legal document. This absorption of property into the husband's domain had a significant impact on female inheritance. It meant that even if a woman technically inherited something, it rarely remained hers in a truly independent sense. Instead, it became part of her husband's household economy. Consequently, any children she had would primarily inherit through their father's lineage and his accumulated wealth, rather than directly from their mother's independent inherited estate. The wealth she brought or acquired through her own lineage would be integrated into her husband's patrimony, strengthening his family line rather than creating a distinct line from her own. This system reinforced the idea that a woman's economic destiny was tied to her husband. Her wealth, once married, ceased to be an independent source of power or influence for her, and became a component of the marital unit, controlled by its male head. Marriage, while providing security and a social role, simultaneously served as a legal and customary mechanism that absorbed women's potential inheritances, diverting their economic control and future generational wealth into their husband's family, thereby restricting women's independent economic power. Number 4. Disinheritance for misconduct. Imagine you are a young woman named Brunhild in 690 AD. You might live under the shadow of a deeply unsettling possibility that your behavior deemed unfitting by your family or community could strip you of any potential inheritance you might otherwise have had. While not a blanket exclusion like Salic Law, the potential for disinheritance due to vague misconduct was a powerful unspoken leash on women's lives, effectively restricting their path to family wealth. In this era, family honor and social reputation were paramount. Laws and customs, while often unwritten, revolved around maintaining the family's standing. For a woman, this meant strict adherence to societal norms regarding chastity, obedience, and marital fidelity. A breach of these norms was not just a personal failing, it was a blot on the entire family's reputation, a stain that could not be easily washed away. Consider what might constitute misconduct in 690 AD. Refusal to marry the chosen suitor, elopement, engaging in premarital or extramarital relationships, or even simply being seen as disobedient or rebellious to one's father or husband could fall under this broad subjective umbrella. These actions, especially if public, could be seen as dishonoring the family. And for such dishonor, legal codes and social customs often allowed for severe consequences, including disinheritance. For example, ancient legal texts, though varied by region and specific to a given period, often contained clauses about the grounds for disinheritance. While explicitly detailed examples for 690 AD are scarce, the underlying principles of family honor and patriarchal authority were strong. A father, with the backing of custom and potentially the nascent legal system, might feel justified in excluding a daughter from inheritance if she brought public shame upon the family. This was not always about criminal acts, but often about social transgressions. Think of Brunhild. If she were to refuse an arranged marriage and instead choose to elope with a man her father deemed unsuitable, her father might, out of anger and a perceived need to protect family honor, decide to cut her off entirely. Her dowry, if one was even planned, might be withheld. Any small share of goods she might have expected could be denied. This act of disinheritance was a powerful tool, not only for punishment but also for social control, ensuring that women conformed to the expected norms. The threat of such a penalty was a constant, unspoken pressure. It meant that a woman's path to any form of inherited wealth was not just dependent on her gender or family structure, but also on her perceived moral conduct and her adherence to societal expectations. This wasn't about her capability to manage property, but her compliance with the social rules of her patriarchal society. This power of disinheritance, due to misconduct, was a significant restriction. It meant that even if a woman was theoretically eligible for some small inheritance, her personal choices and actions as judged by her family and community could strip her of that possibility. It was a societal lever that ensured female obedience and conformity, further limiting their pathways to independent economic security and emphasizing the control exerted by male family heads over their daughters' lives and futures. Number 3. Emphasis on military service and public duty. Imagine a society where land ownership isn't just about wealth, but about responsibility. In 690, and especially in the developing Frankish kingdoms and other successor states to the Roman Empire, land was often deeply intertwined with military service and public duty. If you held significant land, You were expected to provide warriors, participate in local assemblies, and offer fealty and military support to your lord or king. This emphasis on martial and public obligations created a powerful, often unspoken restriction on female inheritance. Consider a powerful landowner, a chieftain, or a nascent noble who holds extensive territories. His ability to maintain his position and protect his lands depends on his capacity to raise and lead a fighting force. This was a man's role. Women, generally speaking, were not expected to serve in combat, lead troops, or actively participate in the often violent political landscape of the early medieval period. They were not seen as performing the direct military service that was often the cornerstone of land tenure. So, while a woman might be capable of managing a household or overseeing agricultural work, her inability to fulfill these military and public duties meant that the primary inheritance of land was almost invariably directed towards men. It wasn't just a preference. It was seen as a practical necessity for the functioning of the state and the protection of the community. If land was inherited by a woman, who would then fulfill the military quotas? Who would lead the levies? Who would sit in the assemblies and pledge allegiance? The answer, in the societal view of the time, was a man. This meant that even if a family had no sons, the land would often be passed to a male relative, a brother, an uncle, a cousin, who could fulfill these obligations. The land was not just a source of income. It was a unit of military organization and political loyalty. To fragment it, or to put it in the hands of someone who couldn't perform these duties, was seen as weakening the entire social fabric. Let's think about the practical implications for a woman like Hilda. If her father was a prominent landholder, the land was his power base, his ability to influence local affairs and demonstrate loyalty to his overlord. Hilda, no matter how intelligent or resourceful, could not personally lead a contingent of warriors to battle or sit in the council of men discussing strategies. Therefore, the land would be directed away from her. If she did inherit, it would be under the strict guardianship of a male relative who would fulfill those duties on her behalf, effectively stripping her of autonomous control and reinforcing the idea that the land's true purpose was tied to male roles. This emphasis on male, military, and public duties was a foundational aspect of early medieval societies. It wasn't always written explicitly as a law that women cannot inherit because they cannot fight, but it was an implicit, powerful driver behind male preferred inheritance. The very nature of land ownership was tied to responsibilities that were gendered male, thereby inherently restricting women's access to inheriting the most significant form of wealth and power in that era. It ensured that the bedrock of society, its land and its martial strength, remained firmly within the male domain. Number 2. The customary law maze. Imagine living in a time when legal rules weren't neatly written down in a book, but were a tangled web of local traditions, oral agreements, and long-standing practices passed down through generations. This was the reality in 690 AD for many communities, and it's what historians refer to as customary law. This maze of unwritten rules often served as an invisible yet incredibly powerful barrier to female inheritance, consistently favoring men without necessarily needing a written decree. Unlike the explicit exclusion of Salic Law, customary law operated through social norms and expectations. It was what everyone knew to be the right way of doing things. For instance, in a particular village, it might be the custom that only sons inherit the main dwelling and arable land, while daughters might receive a share of the livestock or a smaller plot of less fertile ground. Or perhaps just a dowry. These customs weren't debated. They were simply done. Consider a family where a father dies. His community, his neighbors, and his relatives would implicitly understand the local customs regarding inheritance. Custom dictated that the eldest son received the farm, then that's what happened, even if the daughter was more capable or the father had no sons. In the absence of a son, the land might pass to a male cousin, an uncle, or a nephew, rather than a daughter. This was not due to a specific statute, but to the weight of generations of practice. Why did these customs consistently favor men? Scholars suggest several reasons. One was the persistent need to keep land holdings intact to maintain family power and economic stability. Fragmentation among multiple heirs, especially daughters who would marry into other families, was seen as weakening the lineage. Another was the economic and social role of men as primary cultivators, protectors, and representatives of the family unit in an often dangerous world. Men were seen as the continuing line, the ones responsible for the family's economic future and its standing in the community. These unwritten rules were enforced not by a state court as we know it today, but by social pressure, community consensus, and the authority of local leaders or elders. If a father tried to break with custom and leave his land to his daughter, he might face opposition from his male relatives who felt their rights were being infringed upon. The daughter might then face challenges to her ownership, lacking the broad social backing that male heirs typically enjoyed. For women in 690, navigating this customary law maze was particularly difficult. They rarely had the legal standing or social influence to challenge long-established traditions. Their position was often defined by the expectations placed upon them within their community. If the custom dictated that they received a dowry rather than a direct share of the ancestral land, then that was their accepted lot. There was no easy appeal process to a higher authority, no codified legal text to point to that might challenge the ingrained practices of a community. Thus, the maze of customary law, with its unwritten rules and deeply entrenched gendered practices, acted as a silent but formidable barrier. It ensured that even in areas without explicit legal prohibitions, the flow of inheritance overwhelmingly favored men, preserving the male line as the primary inheritors of land and status, and confining women to pathways of wealth that were secondary, indirect, and often under male control. Number 1. The fief and vassalage system. Imagine a society where land isn't just owned, but held. It's a system built on loyalty, service, and military strength, a pyramid of power stretching from the lowliest farmer to the mightiest king. In 690, the foundations of what would later become full-blown feudalism were already taking shape across Europe, particularly in the Frankish realm. This nascent system of fiefs and vassalage created a powerful, almost unbreachable restriction on female inheritance because the very nature of landholding was tied to obligations that were overwhelmingly gendered male. A fief, or benefice, as it was often called in this early period, was a grant of land or income made by a lord to a vassal in return for military service, counsel, and loyalty. It wasn't absolute ownership, but a form of conditional tenure. If you held a fief, you were expected to provide warriors, support your lord in battle, attend his court, and uphold your feudal obligations. These were active, often dangerous duties. Consider a man named Rolf, who holds a significant fief from a powerful count. Rolf's status, his very livelihood, and his family's future are directly linked to his ability to perform his duties as a vassal. He must be ready to ride to war, lead his men, and advise his lord. These were roles overwhelmingly reserved for men in 690. Women were generally not expected to serve as knights, lead armies, or participate in the direct military and political administration of a fief. This created a fundamental problem for female inheritance. If Rolf were to die and his only child was a daughter, Astrid the Count, his lord, would face a dilemma. Who would fulfill Rolf's obligations? Astrid, no matter her capabilities, could not don armor and lead a contingent of cavalry. Therefore, the common solution was that the fief would either revert to the lord, who would then re-grant it to a male who could perform the duties, or it would pass to a male relative of Rolf, a brother, an uncle, a male cousin, who could step into the role of vassal. Even if Astrid were allowed to inherit the fief in a very limited sense, it would almost certainly be under the strict guardianship of a male relative, or even the lord himself. This guardian would then be responsible for fulfilling the feudal obligations on her behalf. This meant that while Astrid might be technically associated with the land, the real power and control, and the ability to continue the relationship with the lord, lay with the male guardian. Her inheritance was merely nominal, a reflection of her status, but not a source of independent power or agency. This system effectively cemented male control over the most valuable form of wealth and power. Land, the very purpose of holding a fief, was tied to martial service, a domain almost exclusively male. It meant that a family's ability to maintain its land and status through generations was contingent on producing male heirs who could fulfill these crucial military and political duties. The evolving feudal system in 690 AD was a powerful engine for redirecting wealth and power away from women. It wasn't always about deliberate legal prohibitions against women. It was about the fundamental nature of the economic and social system itself. Land was power, and power in this era was intrinsically linked to masculine roles of war and governance. As a result, the system of fiefs and vassalage ensured that women were largely excluded from directly inheriting and controlling the very foundations of wealth and influence, thereby heavily restricting their economic autonomy and future.